My friends, I want to tell you about a moment in my early 70s when my youngest daughter, calling to share some genuinely wonderful news about a promotion she had just received, mentioned almost in passing that she had already told 2 close friends before she called me. It was such a small, ordinary detail, offered without any particular thought on her part. And yet I remember sitting with the phone against my ear, feeling a quiet ache I did not expect and was not immediately proud of, a small, wounded recognition that I was no longer, apparently, the very first person she thought to call. I want to be honest with you that this ache troubled me for weeks afterward, not because of what it revealed about my daughter, who loved me deeply and had done nothing at all wrong, but because of what it revealed about me. I sat with this feeling honestly, turning it over across several difficult, private conversations with myself, and I slowly began to understand that this small, ordinary moment had touched something considerably deeper than simple disappointment about a phone call. It had touched a belief I had carried, largely unexamined, since the earliest days of my own parenthood, a belief that my own worth and purpose as a father remained tied, in some essential way, to how thoroughly and immediately my children still needed me. This, I have come to believe, is the hardest lesson most parents eventually face, usually far later than would have served us well, and usually through countless small, ordinary moments rather than any single dramatic revelation. It is the lesson that loving our children fully, across their entire lives rather than only their childhoods, requires us to slowly, deliberately release our own need to be needed by them, a release that feels, in its earlier stages, remarkably similar to loss, even though it is, in truth, simply love finally maturing into its next, more difficult and more honest form. Today I want to share with you everything I have come to understand about this particular lesson, and the many different rooms of a parent's later life where learning it, slowly and often painfully, eventually proves essential. The single insight underlying everything I am about to share is this: for the first 2 or 3 decades of parenthood, being needed and being loved feel almost identical, and this confusion, left unexamined, quietly sets up nearly every parent for a genuinely painful reckoning once their children reach adulthood and no longer require the constant, essential presence that once defined the entire relationship. For most of my life, I had never once distinguished clearly between my children's genuine love for me and their genuine need of me, believing these 2 things to be simply 2 names for the same underlying reality. I finally understood, through considerable painful reflection following that small phone call, that these are genuinely separate things, and that learning to distinguish them clearly, and to find my own worth in the love rather than the need, was the hardest and most important lesson of my entire experience as a father. Everything that follows is simply this one insight, appearing across the many different rooms of a parent's later years where I eventually watched it prove itself true. The first place this insight revealed itself was in that small, ordinary phone call I have already described, where I finally understood that my daughter's decision to tell friends first reflected nothing whatsoever about her love for me, and everything about the simple, healthy fact that she now had a full adult life containing people beyond her own parents. I recognized, examining this honestly, that a 34-year-old woman with her own friendships, her own career, her own full life, calling her friends first about a piece of exciting news was not evidence of diminished love. It was evidence of exactly the kind of full, independent adult life I had spent decades hoping to help her build. The second place this insight revealed itself was in noticing how differently I responded to my children's requests for practical help compared to their simple desire for my company with no particular purpose attached, discovering that I had unconsciously come to value the former considerably more than I valued the latter. I recognized, uncomfortably, that a request for help moving furniture or reviewing a financial decision produced in me an immediate, eager readiness, while a simple invitation to visit with no particular agenda sometimes produced a quieter, less immediate response, as though some part of me had come to measure my own significance in their lives primarily through my usefulness rather than through the simpler, considerably more vulnerable currency of pure, unearned enjoyment of my company. The third place this insight revealed itself was in watching my own son navigate a significant career decision entirely on his own, without consulting me at any point, a decision I only learned about after it had already been finalized. For a difficult week, I experienced this as a genuine wound, evidence that he no longer valued my counsel the way he once had. I eventually understood that his confidence in making this decision independently reflected exactly the kind of mature, capable adulthood I had spent decades hoping to help him develop, and that my own wounded feelings reflected my own unexamined attachment to being needed rather than any genuine failure on his part to love or respect me. The fourth place this insight revealed itself was in recognizing how much of my own daily sense of purpose, well into my 60s, had remained quietly organized around my children's ongoing dependence, an organization that left me feeling genuinely unmoored once this dependence had largely, appropriately dissolved. I discovered that I had never fully developed a sense of my own purpose and identity independent of my role as an actively needed parent, leaving me considerably more vulnerable to this particular grief than parents who had, across the same decades, more deliberately cultivated genuine interests and identity beyond their children's ongoing dependence. The fifth place this insight revealed itself was in noticing my own subtle, largely unconscious tendency to withhold full confidence in my children's independent judgment, continuing to offer unsolicited guidance and correction well into their own established adulthoods, a pattern that, I eventually recognized, likely reflected my own difficulty releasing the role of essential guide considerably more than any genuine ongoing need on their part for my continued instruction. Releasing this particular habit, trusting their own judgment fully rather than continuing to offer guidance they had not requested, required me to directly confront my own attachment to remaining essential, an attachment considerably harder to release than I had ever anticipated before I finally examined it honestly. The sixth place this insight revealed itself was in observing my own quiet relief, uncomfortable to admit even to myself, whenever one of my children did genuinely need my help with something significant, a relief that revealed how much I had come to depend on their dependence for my own sense of ongoing significance and purpose. Recognizing this particular relief honestly, rather than simply enjoying it uncritically as evidence of continued closeness, helped me understand more clearly just how thoroughly my own sense of worth had become entangled with their need of me, an entanglement I began deliberately working to loosen once I finally recognized it clearly. The seventh place this insight revealed itself was in learning to distinguish between genuine concern for my children's well-being and a more self-interested anxiety about my own continued relevance and involvement in their lives, two feelings that had, for years, felt nearly indistinguishable from one another. I discovered that some of my own worry about my children's independent choices reflected genuine, loving concern, while some of this same worry reflected a considerably less noble anxiety about my own diminishing role and influence, a distinction that took considerable honest self-examination to finally separate clearly. The eighth place this insight revealed itself was in recognizing that grandchildren, once they arrived, offered a genuine, if partial, restoration of the being-needed dynamic I had unconsciously been grieving, a restoration I needed to hold carefully, ensuring my genuine love for my grandchildren did not become entangled with an unconscious need to remain essential through this new generation, rather than genuinely learning to release this need with my own children directly. I recognized the temptation, in my grandparenting years, to over-involve myself in ways that reflected my own need to feel essential rather than my grandchildren's actual needs, a temptation I worked deliberately to resist once I recognized its familiar shape. The ninth place this insight revealed itself was in learning to find genuine satisfaction in witnessing my children's independent success and happiness, satisfaction that did not require my own direct involvement or contribution to have occurred, a satisfaction considerably more mature and considerably harder to access than the satisfaction I once derived primarily from being actively, directly needed. This shift, from needing to be the source of their well-being to simply delighting in their well-being regardless of its source, represented, I eventually came to believe, one of the clearest markers of having genuinely learned this particular lesson rather than merely intellectually understanding it. The 10th place this insight revealed itself was in recognizing that my own parents had likely faced this exact same lesson decades earlier, and that my own occasional impatience with what I once interpreted as their excessive involvement in my adult life had likely reflected their own unexamined struggle with precisely the same difficult transition I was now facing myself. This recognition arrived with a considerable measure of retroactive compassion for my own parents, understanding, only now, from the inside, how genuinely difficult this particular release must have been for them as well, a difficulty I had judged rather harshly in my own younger years without ever fully understanding its genuine weight. The 11th place this insight revealed itself was in learning to celebrate genuinely, rather than merely tolerate, the moments when my adult children chose to spend time with friends, partners, or their own children rather than with me, recognizing this choice as evidence of a full, well-lived life rather than any diminishment of my own place within it. This particular shift, from quiet, wounded tolerance to genuine celebration, required considerable ongoing practice, but eventually became, I believe, one of the clearest markers of having genuinely internalized this hardest lesson rather than simply understanding it abstractly. The 12th place this insight revealed itself was in recognizing that my own continued growth, my own pursuits and interests entirely independent of my children, actually deepened rather than diminished our relationship, offering them a father with a genuinely full life of his own to share, rather than one whose entire identity and conversation remained centered exclusively on their own lives and needs. I discovered that my children genuinely enjoyed hearing about my own independent pursuits, a new hobby, a new friendship, a genuine interest of my own, considerably more than I had ever anticipated, and that developing this fuller, more independent life actually strengthened our connection rather than threatening it, as some earlier, more anxious part of me had originally feared it might. The 13th place this insight revealed itself was in noticing a particular pattern in how I responded to my children's setbacks and struggles, discovering that some part of me quietly welcomed these difficulties as opportunities to remain useful, a discovery that troubled me considerably once I finally allowed myself to examine it honestly. I recognized that a father who has not yet released his need to be needed may unconsciously find himself less than fully motivated to see a struggle resolve quickly, since resolution also means the return of a distance he has not yet learned to be comfortable with. Naming this uncomfortable possibility directly, and consciously choosing to hope fully and simply for my children's ease rather than their ongoing dependence, became an important, ongoing practice once I recognized how easily the opposite impulse could otherwise take root. The 14th place this insight revealed itself was in learning to ask my adult children genuine questions about their own lives without any secondary agenda of steering the conversation back toward how I might still be helpful or involved. Questions asked purely from curiosity about who they were becoming rather than from any need to remain a central character in their unfolding story. I discovered that conversations rooted in this simpler, more genuine curiosity produced considerably warmer, longer exchanges than conversations that, however subtly, still carried an undertone of my own need to be included or consulted, a difference my children seemed to sense and respond to even before I had fully articulated it to myself. The 15th place this insight revealed itself was in recognizing that my own fear of becoming irrelevant to my children had, for years, quietly shaped how I responded to their independence, a fear I eventually understood as considerably more about my own unresolved relationship with aging and mortality than about anything genuinely happening within our family relationships themselves. Separating this deeper, more existential fear from my actual relationship with my children allowed me to address each concern more honestly and directly, rather than continuing to let an unexamined fear of my own aging quietly color and distort my perception of a relationship that was, in truth, unfolding exactly as a healthy family relationship should. And the 16th and final form this single insight takes, the one that ties every other form together, is simply this. The hardest lesson of parenthood is not learning to let go of your children. It is learning to let go of needing them to need you, and discovering, once you finally manage this release, that the love remaining afterward is somehow both lighter and considerably more genuine than anything the earlier, need-based version of the relationship could ever have provided. For most of my life, I believed that being needed and being loved were simply two names for the same underlying reality. I finally understood, through considerable painful reflection, that these are genuinely separate experiences, and that a parent who successfully releases the first while continuing to fully embrace the second discovers a relationship with their adult children considerably more mature, more mutual, and more genuinely satisfying than the earlier, need-based relationship, however warm it once felt, could ever have offered. My friends, I want to be honest with you that learning this particular lesson has not been a single, completed achievement so much as an ongoing practice I continue refining even now, well into my 70s. I still occasionally notice the old, familiar ache when a piece of news reaches me secondhand, or when a decision is made without my counsel, or when my presence at some family gathering feels more peripheral than central. What has changed is not that this ache has disappeared entirely, but that I now recognize it clearly for what it actually is, an old, understandable attachment to being needed rather than any genuine evidence that I am loved any less than I have always been. I think often of that phone call, and the daughter who told her friends before she told me, and how genuinely proud of her I feel now, years later, when I finally allow myself to see that small moment clearly rather than through the lens of my own wounded need. She has built exactly the kind of full, independent life I spent decades hoping to help her create, a life containing friends who love her, a career she has earned through her own genuine effort, a confidence in her own judgment that no longer requires my constant involvement to feel secure. This, I have come to believe, was always the actual goal of the entire project of parenthood, not to remain forever essential, but to work myself, deliberately and lovingly, out of a job I once believed was permanent. I want to share one further reflection before we close, something a close friend, a retired pediatrician who spent decades observing families, once told me that I have never forgotten. She said that the entire trajectory of good parenting is, in a sense, a slow and deliberate practice of becoming less necessary, starting from a newborn who requires everything, all the way through to an adult child who requires nothing at all beyond your presence and your love. She said that most parents intuitively understand and even celebrate this trajectory during their children's earliest years, delighting in each new milestone of independence, a first step, a first day of school, a first solo outing with friends. What confuses so many of us, she said, is that this same trajectory, continued faithfully into our children's full adulthood, eventually requires us to celebrate their independence from us just as fully as we once celebrated their independence from a crib or a car seat, a continuity of the very same process that, for reasons she found genuinely difficult to fully explain, feels considerably harder to celebrate once the milestones in question involve our own diminishing role rather than simply our children's expanding world. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, this same quiet ache of feeling somehow less essential to your own adult children than you once were, I want you to know that this ache, however genuinely painful, is not evidence of diminished love. It is evidence, more often than not, of a parenting project that has actually succeeded. Children who have grown into exactly the kind of independent, capable adults you once hoped to raise, adults who no longer need you the way they once did precisely because you gave them everything required to no longer need you in quite that same way. The love, I promise you from my own hard-won experience, remains. It simply requires you to finally find your own worth within it, rather than within the need that once, understandably but incompletely, stood in for it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize your own particular version of this hardest lesson and offers you the courage to begin releasing your need to be needed, trusting that the love remaining on the other side of this release is genuinely worth the difficult, ongoing practice this release requires. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Celebrate your children's independence as the genuine success it actually represents, and trust that being loved, rather than being needed, was always the deeper, more lasting gift you are actually working toward all along. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay proud, stay patient with your own heart, and remember, the goal was never to remain needed forever. It was always simply to be loved, freely, by adults capable of choosing you. Thank you for watching.